The chandelier in the Hargrove mansion cast golden light across the ballroom, making everything sparkle like something out of a fairy tale. Crystal glasses clinked, expensive perfume filled the air, and laughter echoed off the marble walls. It was the kind of evening where wealthy people gathered to feel good about themselves while writing checks to charity. Rosa had seen many nights like this one. For 3 years, she had worked as a housekeeper at this estate, and she had learned to move through these crowds like a ghost. Invisible. Unnoticed. That was the way she preferred it. She carried a silver tray, collecting empty champagne glasses from small tables scattered around the room. Her uniform was crisp and clean, her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun. She kept her eyes lowered, her movements quiet and efficient. In a room full of people wearing gowns that cost more than her yearly salary, Rosa knew her place. The annual charity gala was the biggest event of the year at the Hargrove estate. Over 200 guests had arrived that evening. All of them important in one way or another. Business owners, politicians, celebrities, doctors. They mingled and smiled and pretended to care about the children's hospital fund that would benefit from tonight's donations. Rosa didn't judge them too harshly. Some of them probably did care. And even if they didn't, at least sick children would get help. That was what mattered. She had just picked up 3 empty glasses from a table near the window when she heard a voice that made her stomach tighten. "Did you see the car he arrived in? Honestly, if you can't afford a proper vehicle, just stay home." Vincent Hargrove, the heir to the family fortune, 28 years old, handsome in a cold sort of way, and completely convinced that the world existed to serve him. Rosa had dealt with Vincent many times over the past 3 years. He was the kind of man who looked through people like her, who spoke about servants as if they couldn't hear, who complained about the smallest imperfections in his coffee or his pressed shirts. His mother, the lady of the house, was kind enough. His father was rarely home. But Vincent made up for their absence by being difficult enough for 3 people. She tried to move past him quickly, hoping to reach the kitchen before he noticed her. She didn't move fast enough. As she stepped around a group of guests, her elbow accidentally brushed against Vincent's arm. It was the lightest touch. Barely anything at all, but in that crowded room, at that precise moment, it was enough. Vincent spun around, his face twisted with annoyance. "Watch where you're going," he snapped. The people standing nearby fell silent. Conversations paused. Eyes turned toward them. Rosa felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I'm so sorry." "Sir," she said quietly, keeping her gaze on the floor. "It won't happen again." She tried to step away, but Vincent wasn't finished. "You know what amazes me?" he said, his voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "It amazes me that people like you are even allowed in rooms like this." Rosa's hands trembled slightly, but she kept holding the tray steady. She had learned long ago that the best response to cruelty was silence. Don't react. Don't give them the satisfaction. But Vincent seemed determined to get a reaction. He gestured dramatically toward the center of the ballroom, where a beautiful grand piano sat on a small raised platform. It was a Steinway, worth more than most houses. Polished until it gleamed like black glass. "Do you even know what that is?" Vincent asked with a mocking smile. "Have you ever seen anything like it in whatever village you come from?" A few of his friends chuckled nervously. Some of the other guests looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Rosa forced herself to breathe. In. Out. Stay calm. "I know what it is, sir," she said softly. "Oh, do you?" Vincent raised his eyebrows in exaggerated surprise. "Please, enlighten me. What is it?" "It's a piano, sir." More laughter from his friends. Vincent grinned, clearly enjoying himself. "A piano," he repeated, as if she had said something incredibly stupid. "Yes, technically. But this isn't just any piano. This is an instrument worth more than you'll earn in your entire lifetime. It's played by artists, by masters, by people with actual talent and breeding." He leaned closer. Close enough that Rosa could smell the whiskey on his breath. "People like you," he said slowly, "should stick to what you're good at. Cleaning floors, scrubbing toilets, fetching drinks. Leave the finer things to those of us who can appreciate them." The silence that followed was deafening. Rosa could feel the eyes of dozens of guests on her, some pitying, some embarrassed, some simply curious to see what would happen next. She wanted to say something. She wanted to defend herself, to tell him he knew nothing about her, to wipe that smug smile off his face. But what would be the point? She was the help. He was the heir. In this world, that was all that mattered. "Yes, sir," she whispered. "Excuse me." She turned and walked toward the kitchen as quickly as she could without running. Behind her, she heard Vincent say something to his friends, followed by another round of laughter. The kitchen was warm and busy, full of staff preparing food and washing dishes. Rosa found a quiet corner near the back door and set down her tray with shaking hands. She would not cry. She refused to cry, but her eyes burned anyway, and she had to press her palms against them to stop the tears from falling. "Rosa? Rosa?" What happened? Lucia, her closest friend among the staff, appeared beside her. Lucia was older, with kind eyes and gray streaks in her hair. She had worked at the estate for 15 years and had seen everything. "Nothing," Rosa said, her voice thick. "It's nothing. It doesn't look like nothing." Lucia guided her to a small stool and made her sit. "Tell me," so Rosa told her, "about the accidental touch, the public humiliation, the cruel words about the piano." As she spoke, the shame of it washed over her again, making her feel small and worthless. When she finished, Lucia was quiet for a long moment. "That boy," she finally said, shaking her head. "He has everything in the world. And still, he has to make others feel small, to feel big himself. It's pathetic. Really. I shouldn't let it bother me," Rosa said. "I know that. He's just a fool who doesn't know what he's talking about." Lucia finished firmly. "You hear me? He knows nothing about you. Nothing about where you come from or what you've been through." Rosa nodded, but she didn't feel convinced. Tonight, she was just the maid who got put in her place. Tonight, she was nobody. From the ballroom, she could hear the sound of guests enjoying themselves, the distant notes of background music, the clink of glasses. In a little while, she would have to go back out there and continue working. She would have to walk past Vincent and his friends and pretend that nothing had happened. But for now, she sat in the corner of the kitchen, letting the ache in her chest slowly fade. She had buried so much of herself to survive. So many dreams, so many memories. There was a time when her life had been filled with music, when her fingers had danced across piano keys and audiences had risen to their feet. But that was another life, another person. Here, she was just Rosa, the maid, the invisible woman. And some nights, that truth hurt more than she could bear. While Rosa sat in the kitchen trying to pull herself together, something was going wrong in another part of the mansion. Eleanor Hargrove, the lady of the house and Vincent's mother, stood in the small office behind the ballroom with her phone pressed to her ear. Her face had gone pale, and her free hand gripped the edge of the desk so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "What do you mean you can't make it?" she said into the phone, her voice sharp with panic. "The performance is in less than an hour. People are expecting you." On the other end of the line, a man with a heavy accent was apologizing repeatedly. His name was Andrei Petrov, a world-famous pianist who had been hired months ago to perform at tonight's gala. He was supposed to be the highlight of the evening, the reason many guests had paid $5,000 per ticket. But Andrei was stuck at an airport 300 miles away. A massive storm had grounded all flights, and there was no way he could reach the city in time. "I am so sorry, Mrs. Hargrove," he said through the phone. "There is nothing I can do. The weather. It is impossible." Eleanor closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She wanted to scream, but that wouldn't solve anything. "I understand," she said quietly. "Thank you for letting me know." She ended the call and stood there for a moment, staring at nothing. This was a disaster. The piano performance wasn't just entertainment. It was the emotional peak of the entire evening. The moment when guests were moved to open their hearts and their wallets. Last year, after Andrei's stunning performance, Donations had doubled in the final hour of the gala. The Children's Hospital was counting on that money. Kids who needed surgeries, treatments, and care were counting on it. Without the performance, the evening would fall flat. People would eat, drink, chat, and leave. The donations would be respectable but nothing special, and Eleanor would have failed the one cause she truly cared about. She walked out of the office and found her event coordinator, a nervous young woman named Patricia, waiting nearby. "Well?" Patricia asked hopefully. "Is he coming?" Eleanor shook her head. "His flight is grounded. He's not going to make it." Patricia's face fell. "Oh no. What are we going to do?" "I don't know." Eleanor looked toward the ballroom, where guests were laughing and enjoying themselves, completely unaware of the crisis. "We need to find someone else. Anyone who can play. But who? We can't just pull a pianist out of thin air. There must be someone. One of the guests? Maybe? Someone who plays as a hobby?" Patricia bit her lip. "I can ask around, but Mrs. Hargrove, these people expect professional quality. If we put someone mediocre on that stage, it could be worse than having no performance at all." She was right, and Eleanor knew it. The guests at this gala were not the forgiving type. They were cultured, sophisticated, and quick to judge. A poor performance would become the talk of the evening, and not in a good way. At that moment, Vincent appeared at his mother's side. He had a glass of whiskey in his hand, and a bored expression on his face. "What's going on?" he asked. "You look like someone died." Eleanor explained the situation quickly. Vincent listened, then shrugged. "So cancel the performance," he said. "Just tell people there was an emergency. They'll get over it." "You don't understand," Eleanor said tightly. "This isn't about entertainment. It's about the hospital. The children." Vincent rolled his eyes. "Mother, please. These people will donate anyway. They always do. It makes them feel important. That's not the point. Then what is?" He took a sip of his drink. "Look, you can't just put anyone on that stage. This isn't some community talent show. These people expect excellence. If you drag out some amateur who can barely play a scale, you'll embarrass yourself and the family." Eleanor stared at her son, wondering how she had raised someone so cold. But she didn't have time to argue with him. She needed a solution. "Patricia," she said, "start asking around. Quietly. See if anyone here can play." Patricia nodded and hurried off into the crowd. Vincent watched her go with a smirk. "Good luck with that," he muttered, before wandering back to his friends. Eleanor stood alone, her mind racing. The clock on the wall showed 45 minutes until the scheduled performance. 45 minutes to find a miracle. Back in the kitchen, Rosa had finally stopped shaking. Lucia had brought her a cup of tea and sat with her until the worst of the hurt had passed. "Feeling better?" Lucia asked gently. Rosa nodded. "I think so. I should get back to work. You should take a few more minutes. Nobody will notice. I've already been gone too long." Rosa stood and smoothed down her uniform. "I can't afford to lose this job, Lucia. No matter how awful some people are." Lucia looked at her with sad eyes. "You deserve so much more than this, you know." Rosa didn't answer. She had stopped believing in what she deserved a long time ago. She picked up her tray and headed back toward the ballroom. But as she walked through the hallway, she heard voices coming from around the corner. She recognized one of them as Mrs. Hargrove. Rosa slowed her steps, not wanting to interrupt. But she couldn't help overhearing the conversation. "We've asked everyone," Patricia was saying. "A few people play casually, but no one feels confident enough to perform in front of this crowd. There must be someone." Mrs. Hargrove replied, her voice strained. "What about the orchestra members? The string quartet? They're all specialists. None of them play piano at a performance level." There was a long pause. When Mrs. Hargrove spoke again, her voice was heavy with defeat. "Then I suppose we'll have to cancel. I'll make an announcement after dinner." Rosa stood frozen in the hallway, her heart beating faster than it should have been. The piano. They needed someone to play the piano. For a moment, just a brief moment, a wild thought crossed her mind. but she pushed it away immediately. That was ridiculous. Impossible. She was the maid. She was nobody. She hadn't touched a piano in years, but the thought wouldn't leave her alone. She remembered another time, another life. Concert halls filled with people. Standing ovations that seemed to last forever. The feeling of the keys beneath her fingers. The music flowing through her like water. That was before everything fell apart. Before her father got sick. Before the money ran out. Before she had to give up everything she loved just to survive. She had buried that part of herself so deep that most days she forgot it even existed. But standing in that hallway, listening to Mrs. Hargrove's despair, Rosa felt something stir inside her, something that had been sleeping for a very long time. Lucia appeared behind her. "Rosa? What are you doing standing here?" Rosa turned to face her friend. Her expression must have been strange, because Lucia immediately looked concerned. "What is it?" Lucia asked. "What's wrong?" "They need a pianist," Rosa said quietly. "For the performance tonight. The scheduled performer can't make it." Lucia's eyes widened slowly as she understood. "Rosa, no. I didn't say anything. You didn't have to. I can see it on your face." Lucia grabbed her arm and pulled her aside, lowering her voice. "You can't be serious." "I'm not serious. I'm just—" Rosa shook her head. "It's crazy. Forget I mentioned it. Rosa, I've heard you play. At the community center, when you thought nobody was around. You're incredible. That was different. That was just me. Alone. Messing around on an old piano. It wasn't messing around. It was beautiful." Rosa felt tears threatening again. But for a different reason this time. "Lucia. I can't. You don't understand. I haven't performed in front of people in almost 10 years, and these people, they would never take me seriously. You heard what Vincent said. I'm just the help. I'm just the woman who cleans their toilets." Lucia was quiet for a moment. Then she spoke, her voice firm. "Is that what you believe? That you're just the help?" Rosa couldn't answer. "Because I'll tell you what I believe," Lucia continued. "I believe you're one of the most talented people I've ever met. I believe you've been hiding yourself away for too long, and I believe that scared little girl who let that awful man humiliate her tonight deserves a chance to show everyone who she really is." Rosa stared at her friend, her heart pounding. From the ballroom, she could hear the distant sound of guests enjoying themselves, unaware that the night was about to fall apart, unaware that a woman in a maid's uniform was standing in the hallway, wrestling with a decision that could change everything. She thought of her father, who had sacrificed so much to give her music lessons. She thought of the sick children who needed the hospital's help. She thought of Vincent's cruel words, his mocking smile, his absolute certainty that she was worthless. And somewhere deep inside her, a small flame began to flicker back to life. Rosa walked slowly back to the kitchen, her mind spinning with memories she had spent years trying to forget. She sat down on the same stool where she had cried just an hour earlier. But this time she wasn't thinking about Vincent's cruelty. She was thinking about a little girl in a small town in Brazil who fell in love with music before she could even read. Her father had been a carpenter. A simple man with rough hands and a gentle heart. They didn't have much money, but they had each other. And that had always been enough. One day, when Rosa was 5 years old, her father took her to the town church for a wedding. She had never been inside such a grand building before. The colored light streaming through the windows amazed her. The flowers made her sneeze, but none of that mattered once she heard the music. An old woman was playing the organ, filling the church with sounds that seemed to come from heaven itself. Rosa stood frozen in the aisle, her small mouth hanging open, tears rolling down her cheeks. She didn't understand why she was crying. She just knew that something inside her had woken up. After the wedding, she tugged on her father's sleeve. "Papa," she whispered. "I want to make sounds like that." Her father looked down at her with surprise. Then he smiled. Finding a piano in their small town wasn't easy. Finding money for lessons was even harder. But Rosa's father worked extra hours, took on more jobs, did whatever it took. He found an old piano teacher who agreed to give lessons at a reduced rate. He bought a broken keyboard from a neighbor, and fixed it himself so Rosa could practice at home. And Rosa practiced. Every single day. Before school, after school, late into the night. Her fingers were small, but they moved across the keys like they had been born to do nothing else. By the time she was 8, she had won her first competition. By 10, she was performing at local concerts. By 12, she was invited to play at the National Conservatory in Sao Paulo, where professors watched her with wide eyes and whispered to each other that they had never seen anything like her. "She doesn't just play the music," one of them said. "She becomes it." Her father cried that day. He held her tight and told her that all those extra hours of work had been worth it, that seeing her on that stage was the proudest moment of his life. The years that followed were like a dream. Rosa earned scholarships that took her to bigger cities, better teachers, grander stages. At 16, she received an offer that seemed impossible. A full scholarship to study at one of the finest music academies in Vienna. Vienna, the city of Mozart, Beethoven, Strauss, the city where classical music was born. For a girl from a tiny Brazilian town, it was like being offered a ticket to paradise. Rosa remembered the night her father drove her to the airport. He was quiet most of the way, his eyes fixed on the road. But when they arrived, he turned to her with tears streaming down his face. "You are going to do great things," he said. "I always knew it. From the moment you heard that organ in the church, I knew." She hugged him so tight that she could feel his heartbeat against her cheek. "I'll make you proud, Papa." "You already have, my love. You already have." Vienna was everything she had dreamed of, and more. The academy was filled with talented students from all over the world. But Rosa stood out among them. Her professors praised her technique, her passion, her ability to make the piano sing in ways that touched people's souls. She performed at concert halls across Europe. Critics called her a rising star, a once-in-a-generation talent. She was 19 years old, and the world was at her feet. Then the phone call came. She remembered exactly where she was standing when she answered. In the hallway of her dormitory, still wearing her practice clothes, her fingers still warm from the keys. It was her aunt, her father's sister. Her voice was shaking. "Rosa, you need to come home. Your father is sick." The word she used was cancer. Stage 4. The doctors said he had maybe 6 months, maybe less. Rosa was on a plane the next morning. She didn't pack properly, didn't tell her professors, didn't think about anything except getting home to her father. When she saw him, she barely recognized him. His strong hands, the hands that had built furniture and fixed her keyboard and held her when she was scared, now trembled like leaves in the wind. But when he saw her, he smiled. The same warm smile she had known her whole life. "My little musician," he whispered. "You came." She stayed by his side every day. She fed him, bathed him, held his hand through the pain. The medical bills piled up quickly. The treatments were expensive, and even though they couldn't save him, they could give him more time. A few more weeks. A few more days. Rosa didn't think twice. She sold everything she had. She used all her savings. When that wasn't enough, she withdrew from the academy and gave up her scholarship. She took jobs wherever she could find them, cleaning houses, washing dishes, working in factories. Her professors in Vienna called, begging her to come back. There were people who wanted to sponsor her, they said. Opportunities waiting for her. A career that could still be saved. But Rosa couldn't leave. Not while her father was still breathing. Not while there was still a chance to hear his voice, see his smile, feel his hand in hers. In the end, he lived for 8 months. 8 months of pain and hope and love. On his last night, Rosa sat beside his bed and played a recording of one of her performances on an old phone. Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, his favorite piece. He closed his eyes and listened, a peaceful smile on his lips. "Beautiful," he murmured. "So beautiful." Those were his last words. After he was gone, Rosa felt like a part of her had died too. The music that had once filled her soul now felt like a painful reminder of everything she had lost. She couldn't bear to touch a piano. She couldn't even listen to classical music without breaking down. She sold their small house to pay the remaining debts. She had nothing left. No money, no career, no future. Just grief and memories. A distant relative helped her get a visa to the United States. A fresh start. They called it. A chance to build a new life. But Rosa didn't build a new life. She just survived. She took whatever job she could find, working her way from one city to another until she ended up at the Hargrove estate, a maid, invisible, forgotten. She never told anyone about her past. What was the point? That Rosa was gone. The girl who had played at concert halls, who had made audiences weep with joy, who had been destined for greatness. She had died in that hospital room, holding her father's hand, or so she had believed. Now, sitting in the kitchen of the mansion, Rosa felt something stirring inside her, something she thought she had buried forever. Lucia was watching her quietly. "You're thinking about it, aren't you?" Rosa nodded slowly. "I'm scared, Lucia." "Of what?" "Of everything. Of failing. Of being laughed at. Of remembering." Lucia moved closer and took her hand. "Rosa, I've known you for 3 years, and in all that time, I've never seen you come alive except when you think nobody's watching, and you sit at that old piano in the community center. That's who you really are. Not this." She gestured at Rosa's uniform. "Not the maid. Not the invisible woman. You're so much more than that." Rosa felt tears spilling down her cheeks. "My father gave up everything for my music, everything, and I threw it all away. You didn't throw it away. You made a choice. You chose love. You chose family." Lucia's voice was fierce. "And now, you have another choice. You can keep hiding, or you can walk into that ballroom and show everyone, including yourself, that your father's sacrifice was not for nothing." The words hit Rosa like a wave. For a long moment, she couldn't speak. Then, slowly, she stood up. Her legs felt weak. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst. Every instinct told her to stay hidden, stay safe, stay invisible. But somewhere deep inside, she heard her father's voice. "You are going to do great things. I always knew it." Rosa wiped her tears and looked at Lucia. "I think," she said quietly, "it's time to stop hiding." Rosa walked through the hallway that connected the kitchen to the ballroom. Each step felt heavier than the last, like she was walking through deep water. Her heart hammered against her ribs so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. Lucia walked beside her, squeezing her arm gently. "You can do this," she whispered. "I believe in you." Rosa wanted to believe it too, but the closer she got to the ballroom, the more the doubts crept in. What was she thinking? She was a maid, a nobody. She hadn't performed in front of an audience in almost 10 years. Her fingers probably didn't even remember how to move properly anymore. She stopped just before the entrance to the ballroom, pressing her back against the wall. Through the doorway, she could see the glittering crowd, the expensive gowns, the confident smiles. These people lived in a different world than hers. A world where someone like her was meant to serve drinks and clean up messes, not stand on a stage. "I can't do this," she breathed. "Lucia, I can't." "Yes, you can. Look at them. They'll laugh at me. They'll think it's a joke. Then let them laugh, and then let them listen." Lucia turned Rosa to face her. "Rosa, you have spent years making yourself small. You have let people like Vincent Hargrove decide what you're worth. But you know what? He doesn't get to decide. Nobody does. Only you." Rosa closed her eyes. She could feel her whole body trembling. In her mind, she saw her father's face. Not the thin, sick face from the hospital, but the strong, smiling face from her childhood. The face that had beamed with pride every time she sat down at a piano. What would he say if he could see her now? Would he want her to keep hiding? Would he want her to let fear win? She already knew the answer. Rosa opened her eyes. Okay, she said quietly. Okay. She stepped into the ballroom. The room was buzzing with conversation and laughter. Guests were finishing their desserts, sipping champagne, checking their phones. Near the front of the room, Mrs. Hargrove stood beside the event coordinator, both of them looking worried. The beautiful grand piano sat on its platform, silent and waiting. Rosa made her way through the crowd, weaving between tables and guests. A few people glanced at her, then looked away, dismissing her as just another member of the staff. She was used to that. Tonight, she was counting on it. She reached the front of the room just as Mrs. Hargrove was preparing to make an announcement. The older woman looked exhausted, her elegant composure cracking around the edges. "Excuse me," Rosa said. Mrs. Hargrove turned, surprised to see a maid addressing her directly. "Yes? Is something wrong?" Rosa's throat felt dry. Every word was a struggle. "I heard that your pianist couldn't make it tonight." Mrs. Hargrove's expression shifted to confusion. "That's correct. How did you? I can play." The words hung in the air between them. For a moment, Mrs. Hargrove just stared at her, as if she hadn't heard correctly. "I'm sorry? The piano." Rosa gestured toward the gleaming Steinway. "I can play it. If you need someone." Before Mrs. Hargrove could respond, a familiar voice cut through the air. "Is this a joke?" Vincent had appeared beside his mother, a fresh drink in his hand, and a mocking smile on his face. He looked at Rosa like she was a stain on the carpet. "Mother, please tell me this is a joke," he continued. "The maid wants to play the piano? At our charity gala? In front of 200 guests?" Rosa felt the heat rising to her cheeks. But she didn't look away. She kept her eyes fixed on Mrs. Hargrove. "I know how it sounds," she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "I know what you see when you look at me. But I'm asking you to give me a chance. Just one chance." Vincent laughed out loud. "This is priceless. Truly." "Mother, you can't seriously be considering this." But Mrs. Hargrove wasn't laughing. She was studying Rosa's face with a curious expression. Something in the younger woman's eyes had caught her attention, a depth, a seriousness, a quiet intensity that didn't match the humble uniform she wore. "Where did you learn to play?" Mrs. Hargrove asked slowly. "Brazil and Vienna." Vincent snorted. "Vienna? Right. And I studied ballet in Paris." "Vincent, be quiet." Mrs. Hargrove's voice was sharp enough to make her son blink in surprise. She turned back to Rosa. "Vienna? The conservatory?" Rosa nodded. "I had a scholarship, a long time ago." The event coordinator leaned in, whispering urgently. "Mrs. Hargrove, we're running out of time. If we're going to cancel, we need to announce it now." Mrs. Hargrove looked at the piano, then at the crowd, then back at Rosa. The decision weighed heavily on her face. "If I let you play," she said quietly, "and you're not as good as you say, it will be a disaster. You understand that?" "I understand. You're willing to take that risk? In front of all these people?" Rosa thought about the question. Was she willing? Was she ready to step back into the world she had left behind, to face the music that had once been her entire life? She thought of her father again. His rough hands fixing that broken keyboard. His tired eyes lighting up when she played for him. His last breath, taken while her music filled the room. "Yes," she said. "I'm willing." Mrs. Hargrove studied her for one more long moment. Then she nodded. "All right. Show me what you can do." Vincent grabbed his mother's arm. "Mother, you cannot be serious. This is insane. She's going to humiliate us in front of everyone." "Vincent," Mrs. Hargrove pulled her arm free. "For once in your life, sit down and be quiet." She gestured toward the piano, and Rosa walked toward it on legs that felt like they might give out at any moment. The crowd began to notice something was happening. Conversations faded. Heads turned. People whispered to each other. Confused expressions on their faces. Why was the maid walking toward the stage? Rosa climbed the 3 small steps to the platform. The piano loomed before her, magnificent and terrifying. She had played on instruments like this before, in another lifetime. But that felt like a dream now, something that had happened to someone else. She sat down on the bench. The leather was cool beneath her. The keys stretched out in front of her. White and black. Familiar and foreign at the same time. The room had gone almost completely silent. 200 pairs of eyes were fixed on her. She could feel their skepticism, their curiosity, their judgment. Near the back, she saw Lucia standing in the doorway, hands clasped together, tears already forming in her eyes. And off to the side, she saw Vincent. He had his phone out, probably ready to record her failure so he could laugh about it later. Rosa placed her hands on the keys. They were trembling. She could see them shaking, and she knew everyone else could see it too. Close your eyes, she told herself. Forget where you are. Forget who's watching. Remember why you're here. She closed her eyes, and in the darkness behind her eyelids, she was no longer in a mansion full of strangers. She was in a small house in Brazil, sitting at a battered old keyboard, while her father stood behind her with his hand on her shoulder. Play for me, my little musician, he whispered in her memory. Play like only you can. Finer. Rosa took a deep breath. Her fingers found their positions on the keys, guided by a muscle memory that 10 years of silence could not erase. She chose Chopin. Ballade No. 1-inch G minor. One of the most difficult pieces in the classical repertoire. One of the most beautiful, her father's favorite. For a moment, she hesitated. The fear was so strong she could taste it. Every part of her wanted to run, to escape, to go back to being invisible. But then she thought of Vincent's cruel words, the mocking laughter, the absolute certainty that she was nothing. She thought of her father's sacrifice, the extra hours, the tired eyes, the pride in his voice when he told her she would do great things. She thought of the children in the hospital who needed help, the reason everyone had gathered here tonight, and she thought of herself, the girl who had once made audiences weep, the woman who had buried herself alive. No more hiding. Rosa pressed down on the keys, and the music began. The first notes floated into the air like whispers from another world. Soft, gentle, almost hesitant. Like a bird testing its wings after years in a cage. The guests who had been whispering fell silent. The ones who had been smirking stopped. Something in those opening notes demanded attention, even from people who had already decided this was going to be a disaster. Rosa kept her eyes closed. She couldn't bear to look at the crowd, to see their judgment, their doubt. So she let everything fade away. The mansion, the wealthy guests, the glittering chandeliers. All of it disappeared until there was nothing left but her and the piano and the music that had once been her entire soul. Her fingers moved across the keys, and with each note, something inside her began to unlock. Memories she had buried, feelings she had pushed away, the joy of creation, the pain of loss, the love that never dies even when the people we love are gone. The Chopin Ballade built slowly, like a story being told. It started with longing, a gentle ache that seemed to reach into the chest of everyone listening. Then it grew. The notes came faster, more urgent, weaving together into something complex and beautiful, and almost unbearably sad. Rosa played like she was speaking directly to her father, like he was sitting in the front row, watching her with those proud, tired eyes. She played all the words she never got to say, all the thank yous, all the I love yous, all the grief she had carried alone for so many years. In the audience, something was happening. A woman in the third row pressed her hand to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. An older man near the window closed his eyes, transported to some distant memory of his own. A young couple held hands tightly, moved by emotions they couldn't name. Mrs. Hargrove stood frozen, her eyes wide, her lips slightly parted. She had heard many pianists in her life, some of them world-famous, but she had never heard anything like this. This wasn't just technical skill. This was something deeper, something raw and real and heartbreakingly human. Even the waiters had stopped moving. The bartenders stood still. Everyone in the room had been caught in the spell of the music, unable to look away from the woman at the piano. The woman in the maid's uniform, Rosa, reached the heart of the ballade, the section where Chopin had poured all of his passion and pain. Her fingers flew across the keys with a speed and precision that seemed impossible. The music swelled, filling every corner of the room, pressing against the walls like it wanted to break free and soar into the night sky. And then, just as suddenly, it softened. The storm passed. The notes became gentle again, tender, like a mother singing to a sleeping child. Rosa felt tears on her own cheeks, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The music was flowing through her now, unstoppable. A river that had been dammed for 10 years, finally breaking free. She thought of the first time she had touched a piano, in that little church in Brazil. She thought of her father's smile when she won her first competition. She thought of Vienna, of standing on grand stages, of believing that she would spend her whole life making music. She thought of the hospital room, of her father's thin hand in hers, of his last breath, and she thought of tonight, of Vincent's cruel words, of the years of hiding, of pretending to be less than she was, of letting the world convince her that she was nobody, no more. Rosa played the final notes of the ballade with everything she had. The last chord hung in the air, pure and perfect, vibrating through the silence like a heartbeat. Then it faded, and the room exploded. The applause was like thunder. People leaped to their feet, knocking over chairs, spilling drinks, not caring about anything except expressing the overwhelming emotion that had gripped them. The sound of clapping and cheering bounced off the walls, so loud that Rosa could feel it in her chest. She opened her eyes. Through her tears, she saw 200 people standing. She saw strangers wiping their eyes. She saw Mrs. Hargrove clapping with both hands, her face glowing with amazement. She saw Lucia in the doorway, sobbing openly, her hands raised to her heart, and she saw Vincent. He was still sitting in his chair while everyone around him stood. His phone had slipped from his hand and lay forgotten on the table. His face was pale, his expression completely blank, like he had just witnessed something his mind couldn't process. Rosa looked at him for a long moment. She didn't feel anger anymore. She didn't feel the need for revenge or vindication. She just felt free. She stood up from the piano bench and gave a small bow. The applause grew even louder. Someone called out for more, and others joined in. "Encore! Encore!" Rosa hesitated. Then, slowly, she sat back down. This time, she chose something different. Liszt's La Campanella, a piece so technically demanding that many professional pianists avoided it entirely. A piece that required fingers to move faster than the eye could follow. She played it flawlessly. The guests watched in disbelief as her hands danced across the keys, producing cascades of notes that sparkled like water in sunlight. If the Chopin had been a window into her soul, this was a display of pure, breathtaking mastery. Proof that she wasn't just emotional, she was extraordinary. When she finished, the ovation was even longer than before. People were shouting now, calling her a genius, a miracle, demanding to know who she was and where she had come from. Mrs. Hargrove rushed to the piano, taking Rosa's hands in her own. "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard in this house," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Who are you? How is this possible?" Rosa smiled softly. "I'm just someone who loves music." Later that evening, after the performance, something remarkable happened. The donations poured in. Guests who had planned to write modest checks suddenly doubled and tripled their contributions. A wealthy businessman announced he would match every donation made that night. By the end of the gala, the total had shattered all previous records. The Children's Hospital would have enough funding for years. When people asked why they had given so much, they all said the same thing. The music. The pianist. She had made them feel something real in a world full of shallow performances and empty gestures. As the guests began to leave, Rosa gathered her things in the kitchen. She had changed back into her regular clothes, a simple dress she had worn to work that morning. Lucia hugged her so tightly she could barely breathe. "You did it," Lucia whispered. You actually did it. I couldn't have done it without you, Rosa replied. The kitchen door opened, and Mrs. Hargrove stepped inside. Behind her, looking deeply uncomfortable, was Vincent. Rosa straightened, preparing herself for whatever came next. Rosa, Mrs. Hargrove said warmly. I was happy to help. Mrs. Hargrove glanced at her son, then back at Rosa. I believe Vincent has something he wants to say. Vincent shifted on his feet. He couldn't seem to meet Rosa's eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, stripped of all its usual arrogance. I'm sorry, he said, for what I said earlier, for how I treated you. I was wrong. Rosa studied him for a moment. He looked smaller somehow, like the performance had shrunk him down to his true size. You weren't wrong about me, she said calmly. You were wrong about what you think you can know about a person just by looking at them. Everyone has a story, Mr. Hargrove. Everyone has something inside them that you can't see from the outside. Vincent nodded slowly, still unable to meet her gaze. Mrs. Hargrove stepped forward. Rosa, I don't know what your plans are, but I want you to know that you don't belong in a maid's uniform. Not with talent like yours. I have connections in the music world. If you want, I can make some calls. Help you get back to where you belong. Rosa felt her heart flutter. A part of her wanted to say yes immediately, but another part hesitated. Can I think about it? She asked. Of course, take all the time you need. As Rosa walked out of the mansion that night, she paused at the bottom of the front steps and looked up at the stars. The night air was cool and sweet, and for the first time in years, she felt light, like a weight she had carried for so long had finally been lifted. She thought of her father, somewhere beyond those stars, watching over her. I hope you're proud of me, Papa, she whispered. The breeze seemed to carry her words away, up into the endless sky. And somewhere in her heart, she felt an answer. A warmth, a peace. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer hiding. She was Rosa. A woman who had lost everything and found the courage to begin again. And her music was just getting started.